Hi, welcome to COVID-19 Conversations. I'm Gaik and I'm the director of UoNARI. And together with Maysoun Mustafa, senior manager looking at research strategy at Crops for the Future, we'll be hearing from Professor Chris Gibbins about the importance of rivers to the natural and social environment. Chris is a hydroecologist who's trying to understand the links between physical habitat conditions and biota in freshwater ecosystems. Hi, Chris. Hi, Maysoun.
Hi, good afternoon.
For an urbanite, so Chris, we'll just get into it. For an urbanite or communities with minimal interactions with rivers and the natural environment, why are rivers important? I mean, what are the general indicators of quality?
Okay, well, firstly, I should maybe start by saying thanks a lot for the invitation to come along and speak to you both this afternoon. Why are rivers important? Well, I think probably an easy way to try and describe their importance or to sort of represent their importance is to use an idea that's quite commonplace now in science, which is the idea of ecosystem services. We know that we gain a lot of goods and products, resources from natural ecosystems, whether they be tropical forests or coral reefs. All ecosystems provide us with services that we benefit from, and rivers are very much the same. Of course, it depends which rivers, where they are. We get different services from remote rural rivers, where people might get their food resources directly from rivers. But urban rivers are also important, but they're important for different reasons. And they're important probably most significantly because they're important in helping improve what we often refer to as the livability of cities. They help make cities nicer and more healthy places to be. So let's perhaps just expand on each of those two things in turn. Well, one thing that we know from health professionals is that cities are very busy, very often stressful places to live and work. And so it's important that we have places that we can go when we're not working, just to relax and unwind from the daily stresses of our working world. And rivers in urban areas provide such places where we can go, whether it's on an evening after work or on a weekend, just to simply go walk somewhere peaceful, relax and unwind. And it's important not to underestimate the importance of just having somewhere where we can go and relax and unwind. So they can be important just from a mental health perspective, just in giving you space and an opportunity to find somewhere quiet, away from work, where perhaps there are a few people, and just go and sort of calm down, unwind and relax. So they can be important places for helping mental health. Obviously, they can also be important as places where we can go and do some recreational activities, whether that's jogging, whether that's cycling, whether it's playing some sport, whether it's just playing with our kids. They provide an opportunity to do some physical health, and just like mental health, we know that it's important that we have places to go and do some physical exercise. So where nicer than to go to your local park, very often which have a river or a stream, go run, jog, cycle along a nice stream. So of course the other thing is that that's free, there's no gym fees.
Yeah.
You can say go and relax, and physically, like the mental side of life, go and do things that help your physical well-being, and as of course in so doing partly your mental well-being. And perhaps the final thing to say is that streams and rivers in urban areas also give us an opportunity to connect with nature. Most of our daily lives, if we live in cities, are kind of disconnected from, let's say, the natural world. Mm-hmm. And it's important for us to be able to connect with the natural world for a whole variety of different reasons. And so, of course, having somewhere close by where we live, where we can go and just simply enjoy nature, whether that's on our own or giving our children a chance to learn something about the natural world, is incredibly important. And even the most urban rivers, particularly in Malaysia, can support an awful lot of wildlife. So if you take a walk along an urban river in Malaysia, you'll find herons and egrets, kingfishers, and so on and so forth. And it's very nice for us to just go and see those things, and particularly for us to be able to take our children and see those things and experience nature firsthand. So rivers provide important places that are significant from a mental health perspective, from a physical health perspective, and they also just very simply allow us to reconnect with nature in our lives that are very often disconnected. So I guess in a roundabout way, they're the sorts of things that I would say that make rivers important in urban areas. To answer the other part of your question, which was about what makes a healthy river, well, there are three pillars. One of the three pillars is water quality or water chemistry. The other of the pillars is physical conditions, and then the third of the pillars is ecological conditions. So let me perhaps say a few words about each of those, how we can tell whether a river is or isn't in good health. And it's really quite surprising how easy it is to just look at a river without going in and taking any detailed measurements or taking lots of chemical samples. It's surprisingly easy just to stand by a river and make some sort of assessment of whether that river's in good health or bad health, using each of those three pillars to help us make that judgment. And so simply by looking at a river, looking at the colour of the water, you can say a lot about whether that's likely to be a healthy river or not. So if you go to somewhere, unfortunately, like the River Klang in central KL and take a look off a bridge, you can see that it's very grey, it's very turbid, and you can't see the bed. And all of those things immediately tell you that it's probably quite polluted, either from chemical substances, from chemical compounds, or it's badly polluted with fine sediment that creates that brown, turbid, non-transparent water. So chemistry is one of those pillars, and we can very easily, perhaps surprisingly, just by looking at the river, make some sort of ballpark assessment of whether it's chemically polluted or not. A nice transparent river that you can look into and see the bed may well be relatively healthy. The one that's very grey and turbid may well be not so healthy. Thinking about the second pillar, the sort of physical dimension, well, again, if we use KL and the Klang as an example, if we see lots of concrete along our rivers, lining the banks, or perhaps even on the riverbed itself, then that's probably a good indication that the river's not in a good state of health, because organisms don't really like to live in concrete channels. They like to live in channels that have got sediment and free-flowing water and water that's able to interact and, in fact, move within the bed. So, of course, if you make a bed out of concrete, there's no opportunity for the water to down well into the bed. And similarly, if you build embankments along the riverside and make those embankments concrete, there's no real opportunity for the rivers to interact with their plains, which is very important for river health. So simply looking at a river and looking at whether lots and lots of concrete can be a very good way of telling whether the river's kind of natural characteristics are constrained by the engineering work that we're doing. And then the final pillar is, of course, biological or ecological. And the obvious thing not to forget is that the biological health is really dictated by those two other things. It's dictated by the physical health, and it's dictated by the chemical health. And so even without going in and taking any biological samples, if you can see that the river is grey and it's brown and turbid, if it's constrained by concrete along its banks and so on and so forth, then you're already well along the way to being able to suggest that it's not likely to be a biologically very productive river. Of course, healthy rivers ecologically have got a diverse set of organisms, going from invertebrates that live on the bed of the stream, things like dragonflies and so on, through to lots of birds, some of which are dependent on the insects for their food supply, and then all the way up through to other groups like mammals and so on. So healthy rivers from an ecological perspective should have a nice, diverse biological community that consists of representatives of lots of major groups. And so if we see rivers that are badly polluted, what we find is that certain groups that are sensitive very, very quickly disappear, and we're left with a community of very, very tolerant species that interesting, very often are species that create problems for us, things like mosquitoes, that obviously can transmit disease and so forth. So a healthy river is not just important because it's good for the organisms themselves, but conversely, an unhealthy river can create problems for us because the sorts of organisms that it will tend to support are very often those that carry diseases or can transmit disease. So they're the things that make up a healthy river, and it's surprisingly easy to say whether a river is in a good state of health or not.
Thanks for that, Chris. So one thing that we've been seeing now with COVID-19, social economic activities have been on decline, and there have been stories from all around the world of nature returning to river systems or to cities. So if you could kind of like give us an example of highlight one case study that you've seen and what that means about river systems and natural environments, what it's taught us.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting point, and I have to say it's been one of the things, if there are any sort of positive elements of our whole kind of global combined COVID experience, it's this idea of seeing or beginning to appreciate how quickly at least some of our natural systems can recover if we give them an opportunity to do that. And it's become clear, not just with rivers, but also things like atmospheres and atmospheric pollution, should I say, that if we give them an opportunity, they can recover remarkably quickly. And there's a couple of examples. Perhaps most obviously, I was sent a very sort of heartwarming image that was taken out of a high-rise flat somewhere in Cheng during the period of I think probably about 2 weeks into our lockdown here in Malaysia. And someone happened to have an older image from a few months ago looking down onto the River Klang, and they shared this image together with a photograph that they'd taken that day, a couple of weeks into the lockdown. And even from 100 meters up in a high rise, looking with a mobile phone camera looking down onto the river, you could visibly see the improvement in the river. As I was saying a little while ago, you could see this change from a very, very grey, grim looking section of river to something that was actually almost, not quite, but almost sparkling. You could certainly see the bed. And so that's telling us that over really what's a remarkably and perhaps surprising short period of time, the river's able to recover. Of course, what's happened is that a lot of the industrial activities and urban activities, people like ourselves doing our washing clothes at home, and then that water goes into culverts and eventually into our rivers. Those industrial activities and even just domestic activities, a lot of those things had quietened down. Certainly lots of industry was closed for the period of lockdown. So the sorts of discharges that historically had been going into our rivers hadn't been going in for just a short period of a couple of weeks, but already you could see how those rivers were recovering, at least physically. And so what that kind of suggests to us is that if in future we are able to do things, whether that's put in place policies or work with industry to try and help them improve the quality of the discharges that they're making to rivers, that suggests that if we can do those things, then our rivers themselves have the capacity to recover really quite quickly. One thing perhaps to add is that what we know from ecology is that whilst chemical recovery can be really quite quick, the few weeks that I've just been mentioning, ecological or biological recovery can take a little bit longer. It takes longer for organisms to recover from the pressures and the stress we've been putting them under. But nonetheless, some organisms can recover really quite quickly. And again, there's been some heartwarming stories of people seeing otters in stretches of river where they hadn't been seen for long periods of time. So yes, ecology very often takes longer to recover, or ecosystems take a bit long to recover, but some organisms will return really quite quickly, particularly those that are very mobile, can recolonize historically denuded or depopulated sections of river. So that's been one of the really interesting things as someone who works in river ecology. That's been really one of the interesting things to see how quickly these systems can recover. And so it kind of brings to mind a term that we use a lot in in ecology, which is resilience. And it does indeed seem as though our systems are quite resilient.
So just to kind of put a bit of pressure on this, because we don't want for these sort of anti-global these deniers about global warming to say, well, it's gonna recover. Why should we have to worry about global warming? The Earth will know how to save itself. It's resilient. Wow. COVID-19 has really pushed for urgent and quick responses on a global scale, and climate warming is one of that. So what lessons from these responses can be taken forward to help build more resilient natural environments? Because you can't just rely on nature to be reliant, to be resilient. You need to give some help to it, right? So
Yeah,
specifically steps about what the Malaysian government can take.
Yeah, again, it's a very interesting question. I guess there's lots of different ways to answer it, but perhaps a kind of broad way to think about it relates to relationships between people like myself working in science and governments. So the people who are kind of responsible for making decisions about how we respond to big global issues, whether it's climate change, whether it's COVID, whether it's biodiversity loss. So how, I think for me, one of the interesting things to come out of COVID is the nature of that relationship. So let me kind of explain what I mean by that in a little bit more depth. One of the things that's been interesting, if you look at the media coverage and if you listen to interviews with people from different countries, citizens from around the world, I think it's probably fair to say that lots of them have been disappointed by how well their own particular governments have responded. I listened to people back home in England argue about how disappointed they've been with our government. You listen to people in Spain saying how disappointed they've been in their government, how ill-prepared they were to deal with something like this. And so, of course, it's not to say it's an easy thing to be prepared for, but there's a really important question about preparedness and how we get prepared for these sorts of major problems. And I think the critical thing is, if you look at COVID, for instance, there were already warnings about COVID even years ago. There were warnings in the scientific literature many, many years ago about COVID-19. Scientists were warning. There was news coming out in November about what was happening in China. And so it strikes me that what we really need to do is kind of improve the nature and the strength of the relationship between science and government. So for me, the really important lesson is that kind of we as scientists need to find ways of communicating more clearly, more directly to policymakers to help them be prepared, develop policy, and anticipate, or if not anticipate, at least be broadly prepared for whatever the next major environmental issue is that we might face. As I say, whether that's hopefully not COVID, but whether it's dealing with some consequences of climate change, flooding, increases in major flooding, or whether it's some element of biodiversity loss, the extinction of a species. So what's critical for me is that we can kind of bridge this gap between science and government that still clearly exists, and it exists because government isn't heeding messages to do with COVID, or it's not hearing messages, or we're not being clear enough as scientists in how we're communicating the work that we do. So we need to find ways of better communicating. So I think it's about horizon scanning. It's about looking forward. It's about trying to anticipate future issues and finding ways collectively to deal with them. So if we come to Malaysia, for instance, I think it will be a very positive step post-COVID. One of the things we hear a lot about, or a phrase we're hearing a lot about, is pressing restart. And I think we need to press a restart button with our relationship as scientists with government, rethink how we work together. So there's lots of environmental issues or ecological issues here in Malaysia: deforestation, our rivers are not in a great state of health. We've got tigers that are on the verge of extinction. We need to reset how we work with each other. by and large, universities are kind of functioning in a parallel universe to government, and there's some connection across, but we really need to improve that connection to sit and work together much more closely, horizon scan together, so that we can collectively kind of anticipate problems, hopefully, before it's too late. So there are probably lots and lots of small things that we can do, but for me, the big sort of lesson from COVID is about this big relationship between people like myself working in universities doing science that's really designed to help decision makers and the decision makers themselves, because somewhere along the line there's a lack of or a miscommunication between people working in universities and government. So it would be nice to take the big lesson from COVID, which is about people in science and people in government working more closely together to try and head off these sorts of problems.
Yeah. So for you and like for your team, how has this now influenced or impacted your ongoing activities, ongoing research activities? And how do you think that it will shape future research as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have to say that I'm not, the sort of research that I do doesn't really involve me directly with COVID, but I think it has caused us to think a little bit about, let's say, more direct connections between environmental health and human health and welfare and well-being, thinking about pollutants, thinking about transmission of diseases and how perhaps disease can be transmitted through the river systems that I'm interested in and work on, and the things that are responsible for that transmission. So, for example, one of the things that I've got interested in the last couple of years is microplastics, and microplastics can be important for a whole series of different reasons, but one is that they can actually transmit disease. And so a small area of research that I've been trying to pursue over the last few months with some PhD students is just to understand some fundamental aspects of microplastic contamination in Malaysian rivers. And just to give you something of a context, of course, plastic pollution is quite well known nowadays. It's a major issue if we think about oceans. But it's really only over the last few years that we've begun to realise that not only are our oceans and rivers polluted with large pieces of plastic bottles and so on, but in fact that they're also polluted with tiny fragments of plastic that we can hardly see with the naked eye. And in some ways, they're a more dangerous or insidious problem by virtue of the fact that they're so small we can't see them, but particularly because they can be ingested by organisms, and they can be ingested by people. So we've been doing some work just to understand some very, very basic things related to the levels of microplastic contamination in Malaysian rivers, because quite alarmingly, we know more or less nothing about how much microplastic there is in Malaysian rivers. And of course, if we think about human health, it means then we don't really know much about the dangers this microplastic might be posing in terms of transmitting or conveying pollutants or diseases. Don't forget, rivers are our kind of veins or our arteries in the landscape, and they're moving water around that we're using. And so by the same token, things like microplastics in those rivers might be conveying things that are dangerous to us. But we know alarmingly little about microplastic in Malaysian rivers. There's more or less been no science. We don't know anything about the concentrations in our rivers. We don't know how much there is in our drinking water. And we don't know how much there is in the organisms that we're taking from rivers and eating. So, of course, there's still, particularly in rural areas, but even in sort of peri-urban areas, in areas around the edge of places like KL, people are still taking fish from rivers and eating them. And it's quite likely, I suspect, that those fish are contaminated with microplastics, for instance.
So
and we know more.
Could you say a little bit about where the microplastics could be coming from and why they're in our water system, like coming through the pipes possibly?
Of course, yeah. Well, in fact, we're all responsible for microplastics. Everything we do in our daily lives is probably generating some element of microplastic pollution. We mentioned earlier people doing that, putting clothes in their washing machines. And of course, when you dry your washing machine, you get tiny fibers that are made of plastic coming off your clothes, synthetic clothes, synthetic materials that then go off into the drains. And those drains run into watercourses, and those watercourses eventually drain into our river systems. When we drive to work, when I drove to work this morning, probably lots of rubber came off my tyres, just as a consequence of the abrasion of the tyres on the tarmac of the road surface. That will sit on the road. Next time it rains, it will be washed off. It will go into the drains, and that will run off into our rivers. One of the scary things that we know is that, of course, before it gets to our taps, we put water through sewage treatment works.
Right.
But unfortunately, we know that sewage treatment works are not, at least the technologies that we're currently using, were never designed to deal with microplastics. They're designed to deal with other things. And so not all microplastics are removed from water during wastewater treatment. And so the material that's either come off our roads or it's come off, lots of agricultural activities use plastics in products that they spray on land. Many people use makeup. Microplastics are incorporated into makeup, for instance. So there's a whole range of different products that produce microplastics. Unfortunately, they end up in our rivers, but unfortunately, again, when that river water is taken into wastewater treatment plants for cleansing before being delivered to domestic supply, unfortunately, all of that microplastic isn't removed from the water. So it's highly likely. There was a really nice, another scary study that was published within the last few months by WWF, suggesting that we might all be ingesting enough microplastic each week, not each year, enough microplastic to make a credit card. Yes, enough microplastics to make a credit card.
Wow.
So that kind of gives you an order of magnitude of the problem. But it's a magnitude that we don't have any estimate of here in Malaysia, because there's just simply not been the science. So as a scientist, I think it's really interesting, but it's also really important from a societal perspective to try and understand the nature of the risks that we face as a consequence of our daily activities, whether it's us washing things at home or whether it's driving to work. All of these activities that produce microplastics.
So I'd like to tie this back to COVID-19 and the lockdown, right? Because as you've seen, I mean, earlier on, not in this conversation, but earlier on, we've talked about how even satellite systems could capture pictures of cleaner rivers. And because the industries and the factories weren't working. And what are the lessons in terms of, now that we are worried about microplastics, there could be more regulations or enforcement. There could be better ways to treat water. Are there already existing water treatment systems?
Yeah, I think there's a number of different ways to deal with the problem, going from treatment technologies, which are really just, the best way to think about those is that they're not really solving the problem. They're just putting a sticking plaster over things. So you really want to look at the root cause of the problem, which is how we're generating all these microplastics to begin with. And it's about us all to look at what we do on a day-to-day basis. Think about our decisions. There are things, for instance, that you can put in your washing machine to stop microplastics being flushed out.
Okay.
So there's a whole range of things, going from better wastewater treatment facilities that now exist. It's just that very often, the systems that we're using currently are outdated, but they could be updated. But there's a whole raft of changes going all the way back to the initial production of these microplastics in the first place. And then from a policy perspective, it's about understanding perhaps where the hotspots are. And that's one of the things that we're interested in doing through the work here at Nottingham. Just if we take a river system like the Langat here on the outskirts of KL, are there any hotspots of microplastic contamination? So where are the major sources of microplastic contamination? And by trying to limit those sources of discharge into the watercourses, then again, we're able to deal with the problem. So there's a whole range of different approaches that we can take, going from policy related to supporting or encouraging or subsidizing people to buy these parts that fit into their washing machines that help filter, to upgrading sewage treatment works and so on and so forth. So there's a whole raft of things that we can do, but it all starts with kind of understanding where these things are coming from and what the levels of contamination are in our river systems, and particularly what the risks are to people. And understanding the risks comes back to understanding how much there is in our rivers, how much there might be in the food that we're eating from rivers and so on. So my kind of interest is on that side of things, but of course, developing that knowledge helps underpin the policies that the government can hopefully then put in place through institutes like Department of Irrigation and Drainage and so on and so forth, and the other government environmental agencies that are responsible for monitoring and managing environmental quality and standards here in Malaysia.
No, thank you for that, because I really can see how everything is kind of connected. I mean, this is also very much tied to food security, and that's why we have to do interdisciplinary research, because you're looking at rivers and how to keep the water system safe, but at the same time there's also fish in the rivers that we eat. And so if we want to have food security, we have to make sure that there's no microplastics in the water system and in the rivers. And as individual consumers, it's like it's not just a matter of I'm going to be vegan or vegetarian, because even the stuff that we're going to be watering our plants with will have plastic. So how are we ever going to get away from it? And you really have to get government involved, and government will have to think about the economy in another way, not just about getting those factories started again, about regulating a different kind of production.
Yes, precisely. Yeah. It's. I mean, again, another one of the things that's another one of the phrases that's emerging as a result of COVID is kind of alternative futures. What's the future going to look like for us? And we're in a really quite amazing position now of being given the shock, perhaps, that we need to think seriously about how we behave and what alternative future that we want for ourselves. And to go back to what you were saying there a moment ago, yes, absolutely, these systems are really intricately linked. In order to improve things, if it's microplastics or other types of chemical pollution or ecological health, we need to see the whole system. We need to be able to picture and understand the whole system. And thinking about food security, it's not just about the amount, for instance. It's of course, what's the quality of that food? Is it contaminated? Where's it coming from? What are the implications? And so on and so forth. And we can only begin to improve food security if we think about the broad set of things that influence food availability and food quality, whether it's fish in our rivers or whether it's the crops that we're growing in agricultural areas or whatever it happens to be.
Thank you so much, Chris.